How y'all doing? For this book review, I'm going to go over a anthology by Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Cimmerian, or Conan the Barbarian, and that is Kull, Exile of Atlantis. This book right here was published by Del Rey, who has made a small little library of Robert E. Howard stories. 3 of them are the original Conan stories, and usually one volume a year having a set theme of stories, or one of the characters that he's created and then move it all into one volume. In this case, we're going to explore Kull. Conan, for those who don't know, written by Robert E. Howard, he's set that in a fictional past that was before the last great ice age, and through the cultures and stuff like that became the predecessors of later ancient cultures, from the Egyptians, the Celts, and so forth, and that. Even the Picts, the mysterious Picts in our time, he even gives an origin story to that through the Barbarian age, and in this series of books we even go further with the Pictish culture. I'll explain that later. In this book, beautifully illustrated by Justin Sweet from the cover and interior art, loaded with it. It has all 15 stories that Robert Howard has written of Kull of Atlantis, full stories and fragments. Some of his earlier drafts that will later, or the concept that will later be evolved into Kull, and a nice little essay called The Atlantean Genesis by Patrice Leonat. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Now, in order to tell the setting of Kull of Atlantis, let me explain how Conan's world is set up. Conan takes place in a time before the last great ice age. You can read about that in Robert Howard's essay called The Hyborian Age, which is an essay that explains the Hyborian Age, which that takes place before the last ice age, and how it connects to our cultures and people in the ancient times, the Celts and Picts and so forth. Kull takes place before that. Atlantis is a real place in this world, but it's not a high advanced society like you read in a lot of other fiction. This is a barbaric land with barbaric people, very savage. It takes a survivor to live there, and that's where our main protagonist Kull comes from. And as I said, he's an exile of Atlantis. He did something when he was very young that caused the people to go against him, and these are a series of short stories that you read, but most of it when he's already made king. He somewhere after he was exiled, he goes on a series of adventures which he doesn't really talk about. It's talk about a few of things that he went through. He was a pirate, a gladiator, and stuff like that. Eventually, he led an army that overthrew the king of the ancient great empire of Valusia, and now he becomes king about that. And most of the stories take place while he's a king. Now, there's basically, most of the stories deal with Kull as a king and the hardships he has to face under that. This guy's a barbarian from Atlantis, and so he's not used to, he's not like the high civilized person that people expect to be on the most ancient empire of this world, which is Valusia. In fact, many people don't like the fact that he is the king, because how dare a barbarian sit on the throne, despite the fact that the last ruler would need to be kicked out. We've heard this theme before. So that's one of 2 things that are usually the setups of the adventures of Kull throughout this book. It's either the people trying to assassinate Kull, and where usually the other one deals with some conflict involving man and woman who want to get married, but the customs and laws and traditions prevent that, and through that is either the start or connected to the events that happen within a particular story. So even though was beginning of a world that Robert Howard created for these series of adventures involving Kull and the world he lives in, only 3 of the stories plus a poem were published in Weird Tales magazines during his lifetime. The rest were rejected not only by Weird Tales, but other pulps at the time, Argosy and such. But despite all that, all was not lost. You see, one of the unpublished stories that involved Kull was later rewritten as the first Conan story. For those who want to know, the original Kull story was by this Exile, and Howard took that, and since it wasn't published, it was a story untold, he rewrote that as a first Conan story, Phoenix on the Sword. And that was published in Weird Tales magazine, I think June or July of 1932. Yes, these stories go back that far. This is the pulp story. This is the pulp era we're talking about here. So that's how you have this. That's the predecessor how Conan came to be. Was through the basis of this one story after Howard came up with the concept of Conan. And rest is history involving that. We know how popular Conan is, but before Conan there was Kull, and and I think this is a good place to start for those who don't want to get too heavy into Conan, but want to get into the works that's interesting about Robert E. Howard and his sword and sorcery stories. This was the start of one of the earliest sword and sorcery stories as we know it.
As I said before, this volume is fully illustrated by fantasy artist Justin Sweet. Robert E. Howard was not only famous for the characters he created, like Conan the Cimmerian, Kull of Atlantis, Solomon Kane, Brad McMorton, and others. He was also famous for his prose, which really helped the readers become immersed into his writings through a wonderful combination of poetic, grimness, and realism. It's one of the things that's enduring about the writer that lives up to this day. Using both paintings and sketches throughout this book, Justin Sweet brings a haunting tone and atmosphere in each of the illustrations. He does a wonderful job, whatever background he does show, bringing out its majesty and exoticness of the setting. And of course, it can't be Robert E. Howard without showing intense action, and he does a wonderful job doing that in the scenes that call for it. In the introduction of the book, Sweet hopes that if Howard was alive today, he would look at his art and forgive any inaccuracies, and hopes that it would match the spirit of his writings. I can't speak for Howard, but I say he does a wonderful job doing it.
Going over some of the recurring characters that show up in the Kull stories, there is Tu, or Ta, however you pronounce it, it's just T-U. He is the advisor of stately manners, explains the laws and that come to be a pain in the butt for Kull when confronted with a problem here. He can't easily solve it because the laws have been written down by the ancients long ago, and they should never be changed. Another character is Kanu, who's an ambassador of the Picts that is allied with Kull. Not only is he just ambassador, he's also an informant, and gives him intelligence of things outside the court. And through him, we're introduced to Brule the Spear Slayer, who is a Pictish warrior who is Kull's trusted partner and friend. Now I want to go over a summary of some of the stories in this volume here. We'll start from the beginning. This one was an untitled story during Howard's lifetime, but when it was published posthumously, it was called Exile of Atlantis. It shows a very young Kull, while he was still in Atlantis with two other guys. They witness a woman being executed through a burning at the stake. And this is where Kull becomes exiled from his people by quickly giving her mercy through a quick death. Another one is the Shadow Kingdom. This is one of the several stories that has the same premise of Kull being executed by some usurpers here. In this case, it's not from ordinary humans. This is where we first are introduced to Brule the Spear Slayer and Kanu, the Pictish advisor. You're introduced to these characters, and Kull, while being a new king in all this, he finds that there's more to Valusia and even the people currently living there know. And so there's an assassination attempt by some very ancient beings here. Another story is the Screaming Skull of Silence, where Kull was, he hears the stories of this wise wizard of some sort who, through his tower, locks something very important there. Could be treasure, could be something else. Kull, wanting to investigate, comes in, and it was a time of his life where he was truly horrified, compared to any other moments of his life. This next story is an unfinished story, simply just called Untitled Draft. Obviously never published, it was never finished. And the premise of this is where Kull is told by his advisor that these two lovers ran off together. The woman of the group has left her husband to be at the altar to run off with this guy Felgar. Kull doesn't care, despite the grave offenses to traditions and all of this. But he's been told that Felgar left a message and calls Kull a scoundrel, and when he comes back, he's going to dress him up as a woman in disgrace. Well, that ticked Kull off. You don't slight him. So he grabs Brule and several of his trusted guard and chases him down through several countries, trying to catch up with him. And when they do, and around on the trail, they come across this river where a ferryman shows up, and he says, just beyond here is a land of enchantment and the unknown. Be careful crossing here, but I won't stop you. And he calls himself Charon, and and this is the river Stages, and then this is where the story ends when they all decide to go cross, but we don't know what happens here. And this is one of those I wish Howard would finish, because I'm curious on what he would have wrote at this point. And it's also his attempt to take something, Charon, the river Stages, is going to be Charon and the river Styx, in what we find in Greek myth. So just when it gets interesting, it stops right there as unfinished. What would he wrote? I'm just going to be driven from the mystery. One of the complete stories I like is The Cat and the Skull. Kull is introduced to a woman whose cat supposedly, is very ancient and very wise. This cat is millennia old, one of the oldest beings in the known world, and his cat also has prophetic powers and such like that. So this cat is with this woman who just wishes, for a boon to marry someone of her choosing. Again, this is one of those that's a conflict between two people wanting to marry and the customs prevent it. But with her is, but this cat, Cerames, has her as a caretaker, but also has a slave servant who's silent and masked at all times. Kull is kind of skeptical of this cat's ability, but the cat starts talking to him, and starts telling him things that no one else should know. So Kull takes the cat in as an advisor, and then as they were talking about things, the cat tells him that his friend Brule the Spear Slayer is trapped in this lake, this forbidden lake, and he needs to go and rescue him. And that's where Kull goes on a quest by himself to go under the lake and finds the dangers and finds his underwater society over there to see if he's there. Now, this story is one of those that introduces a closest thing to a main villain, of Kull, and that is Thulsa Doom. Yes, Thulsa Doom. Many of you who watched the movie Conan the Barbarian knows Thulsa Doom was James Earl Jones' character. One that turns into a snake and had the whole cult of Set. In this one, Thulsa Doom is an ancient, powerful wizard that has a skull for a head. For Dungeons and Dragons, this is a lich, an undead wizard. But he only shows up in this story. I think he shows up, in some form or another in a couple of Howard stories, not in Kull. But it's one of those where, as the events go along, you wonder, is this cat really ancient? Can this cat really talk and make prophecies and stuff like that? I don't want to give the ending about it anyway, especially to a short story. But it's one of those, shows a lot of the fantastical elements of the world that Kull lives in. This next story is one you can't talk about Kull without mentioning this story. It's the Unpublished Story by this Exile rule. The two parts of this story is, one, a group of conspirators from the court is trying to make an assassination attempt against Kull. The other story is about a slave girl who's in love with a man. He wants to marry her. The problem is, he's a nobleman, she's a slave, and the laws of Valusia are very strict that this cannot happen. The man comes to Kull and says, "Look, there's this woman, I want to marry her, but I can't." He says, "Well, can you buy her?" He says, "No, I don't want to just buy her as a slave. I want to marry her." He says, "You can make yourself a slave." "I would want to do that, but they're not allowing me to. Her slave owner won't do this." And so, this type of story structure happens about 2 or 3 times throughout this book. I think because of the fact that this story is was not published, because again, 3 stories were published of all the stories here in this book, and it didn't allow Howard to expand to other plot threads. So yeah, it's a couple. So you'll find many reoccurring stories throughout this, but it's not a bad story. But this is one my great uncle told me is like Howard took his worst Kull story and turned it into his best Conan story, and when you read the story that this was converted into, Phoenix on the Sword, the first Conan story, you can see exactly how he rewritten everything, but also changed it, accordingly. So yeah, you can't talk about Kull without, talk about by this Exile rule, because this is the one that's, is the basis for the first Conan story. This next story is one, it's going to be a crossover with another creation of Robert Howard's, Bran MacMorn. You see, he writes another character. Bran MacMorn is the last king of the Picts, and his stories take place in Great Britain during a Roman invasion. And in this story, Bran McMorn, he's setting up other, him and his picks along with other people of Britain. They're gathering to fight off the Caesar's armies, but they're having a hard time trying to keep, some of the troops are not, wanting to stay. They're going to go off their own way, but they need their help. So this old ancient druid comes by and, he says, that jewel you keep in your crown is going to be a means of get somebody the help we need. And they summon Kull from his time to ours. He thinks, Kull comes in and he thinks this is all an elaborate dream, but he goes along with it. So he does help them out. So this is one of, it just shows that, that even Howard had his own internal universe with all his creations. Marvel and DC weren't the first ones. But this story was also reprinted again in the other volume of Bran McMorn's stories, and there's also some good ones in here. So this is sort of historical fiction slash with some also fantasy elements towards it as well. And also the Kings of the Night was also republished in this as well. So if you don't have Kull, you don't need it if you got this one right here. And so here we are. We have Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan, and that's what we think of when we think of the sword and sorcery genre, or heroic fantasy, or whatever you want to call it. But it's not. But Conan wasn't the first attempt in making what is called sword and sorcery. That would be Kull, and while Kull was not a booming success as he was hoping to do, through this and his techniques of world building and character creation, he took off with Conan and became a success it was right before he died in 1936. I want to read one particular thing that does describe Howard very well. This is in Atlantean Genesis, the essay at the back of this book, and so here we go. What Howard was unaware of, in spite of the unusual critical praise of these three stories received over the years, that was to be given birth to the new subgenre of literature since dubbed heroic fantasy, epic fantasy, or sword and sorcery, to dominations as unsatisfying as they are reductive. The mixing of historical or pseudo-historical elements with elements of fantasy was nothing new. On the contrary, it harked back to the very beginnings of literature. What Howard brought to the form was to modernize it, getting rid of the chivalrous aspects, flowery language, and stilted personalities, writing violent tales in a realistic style that reflected Howard's environment and that of his readership. Critic George Knight once argued very convincingly, because his most popular creations are his fantasy tales, Howard is put into the category of fantasy writer, yet the most interesting aspect of his fiction is not the fantasy but the realism, a realism springing from Howard's class, environment, beliefs, and the age in which he wrote. So that's a good summation about Howard's effect on the popular culture, particularly through fantasy and the sword and sorcery genre he helped start. But of course, as interesting as Kull is, there aren't too many stories. 15 of them. Some of them are fragments. A couple of them don't even have Kull in them at all. He's just it has events that take place in his time where he's just mentioned on it. So why read that when we have more complete stories like Conan that also expanded for several stories? What have you? Well, there's a little bit of food for thought I have. Sorry if it's a bit incoherent. There's a lot of this that could have been, and there's also some unfinished things about Kull. But at the same time, I probably wouldn't change that. Think about fandom, for instance, in general, particularly the most popular things about it that we want more of. We don't want them to go away, but we want more. We want of it. We're not satisfied with what's started off and is there and that got us into the first place. We seem to want more. And the problem is, by getting more, we end up getting disappointed. Take, for example, Star Wars. For the longest time, we had the original trilogy, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. Fans got, wanted more, but of course, outside, they've expanded to a couple cartoons, a whole series of expanded universe novels of various, with not all of them completely canon, some more than others. But then, he came out with the prequels. And people really liked it at first, and then all of a sudden, people look back and say, these are, not that great. Some would say they're flat out terrible. Worst things that happened. And then they went to Disney, and everyone was happy about that. And then they got more of it, and everyone was getting more and more disappointed with this. Star Trek has a similar thing. So yeah, sometimes, whether a series of stories are just fragments or incomplete, if it's not fully complete, yeah, there's something, we may not like that, but at least what is there is good, and you should, probably want to keep it at that. It's a little bit of, a lot of things we enjoy in life are incomplete. There's a lot of Greek myths we don't have. Gilgamesh is an incomplete work of literature, but we still enjoy that, much as we like to have that complete. And the Eddas, the Norse mythology. There's a lot of stories that are not there. Egyptian mythology is filled with fragments, but what's there we enjoy, and and we have to be careful wanting more and trying to expand it, because we risk disappointing and killing what brought us to like it in the first place. So yeah, that's kind of a food for thought, and that sort of unstructured rambling there. But with that said, Kull, Exile of Atlantis by Delray Books, illustrated by Justin Sweet. Very easy to find, still in print, along with the rest of the Delray books of Robert Howard's work. But this one right here has a wonderful tone and atmosphere and all that, and kind of gives that sense of inspiration of what to be. Things like this is what inspired elements of current fantasy, like Dungeons and Dragons. Very good source to have this on hand. Books like this of what your D&D game could be, especially if you're an old school grognard. With that said, thank you all for watching. You have a nice day.